Chapter 19, AP Environmental Science, is going to deal with environmental hazards and human health. In other words, what gets us sick, what can potentially kill us, too. Both of those. Little case study that's actually from Wisconsin. We know, particularly in the Great Lakes, we actually have a very high incidence of mercury and something called PCBs. That's actually a whitefish, which was caught from an inland lake in Wisconsin, and it's got very. So let's dive into that. Mercury toxic effects, rather. All mercury compounds are toxic. It doesn't matter if it's vapor, if it's liquid, whatever it is. Again, think about mercury. It's actually a metal that's liquid at room temperature. Back in the day, your parents, myself, we used to play with it in chemistry class. Now we know it's a toxin. 1/3 in the atmosphere comes from natural sources. However, 2/3 are from human activities, particularly burning coal. Coal releases a very large amount of mercury, and that's how we got it into the Great Lakes in the first place. That's how China is getting it into the oceans near them, which is why we see high incidence of salmon over there having mercury. Two main human exposures, fish, of course, and inhalation of vaporized mercury. Greatest risk is brain damage, toxin. We, of course, face health hazards from biological, chemical, physical, and cultural factors, all of which we are going to now. First of all, risk. If you're into the world of actuarial science, that's the idea of figuring out what's the probability of you dying, basically. If you live your life to its extreme, you do a lot of skydiving and airplane riding and things like that. Of course, your likelihood of dying is greater, so that's risk. Expressed as a ratio or percentage, risk assessment using statistical methods to estimate harm. That is what an insurance person would do when they give you health insurance, for example. What they do is they ask you questions like, how often do you drink? Do you smoke? Do you take lots of trips? Things like that. Because as you do more things like that, what happens is your likelihood of you dying actually increases. So you're not going to get a good insurance rate. Risk management then is deciding whether and how to reduce a particular risk. The big thing is as we talk about environmental stuff. So risk assessment, what we do is hazard identification. What is the hazard? Probability of risk. How likely is the event? Smoking, for example, if you're a person who smokes, the likelihood of you dying early is actually very high. And not only dying early, but dying very painful, slow death. That's going to cost lots of money in our insurance world. Consequences of risk, what is the likely damage? Risk management, on the other hand, the comparative risk analysis, how does it compare with other things? So smoking versus drinking, for example, versus driving a long distance every day to work. How do we reduce this risk? How will the risk, what strategies will we do to reduce that? And financial commitment, how much money should we spend on it? A big thing we're going to talk about is malaria. Malaria has been treated as a very bad thing because it is in tropical regions with things like DDT. But of course, we know the effects of DDT are. So what do we do? So here are the types of hazards. There's biological, things like pathogens. An organism that causes disease in another organism. HIV, for example, is a biological hazard. One big scare that we potentially could have in the United States is something like Ebola or avian flu. Chemical hazards, harmful chemicals. So mercury, for example, is one of them. PCBs, gasoline sitting in your garage. Going and breathing in those fumes when you're pumping gasoline into your car, that's another hazard. Natural hazards are things like fire, earthquake, volcanoes, etc. Now, obviously, where we live, tornadoes are probably the biggest threat, maybe floods. Yeah. Cultural or unsafe working conditions, it could be poverty. Are you in a culture that is poverty-driven? Poverty, if you are living poor, you probably don't have adequate food. You have malnutrition, undernutrition. You have inadequate clean drinking water. Lifestyle choices, of course, do you smoke, do you drink too much alcohol, and other with that. Most serious biological hazard we face are things like flu, AIDS, tuberculosis, diarrheal diseases like cholera, malaria. We'll take a look at this in a little bit. A couple ways of looking at this. Infectious diseases are pathogens that invade the body and multiplies. You've all had these before. You've had a cold. That's a pathogen. Of flu you might have had. That's a pathogen. So viruses, bacteria, parasites. Of course, parasites could be extreme from the plasmodium of malaria. It could be cryptosporidium that affected Milwaukee at one time. There's transmissible and non-transmissible. Transmissible diseases are those that we get from another person or another animal, or some sort of vector brings it into us. Infectious diseases transmitted between people. It could be blood contact, it could be sharing needles, sexual contact, things like that. So here are some ways. Maybe we get it from our pets, believe it or not, some diseases. Livestock. There was a scare of mad cow disease, which is from cows, obviously, in England in the 1980s. It's a prion that causes these cows to literally go nuts, and we don't want those to transfer over to humans. Wild animals, we could get different diseases in Wisconsin right now. We have concerns with chronic wasting syndrome, which is something that affects deer. Maybe that'll transfer over to humans. It hasn't yet. Insects, of course, like malaria, food, we can get pathogens from water, of course, air. Air we're going to talk about a little bit more when we do an air pollution unit. Anyway, it can go from human to human. Unfortunately, sometimes things like HIV can go from mom into common way that AIDS is still spread, unfortunately. Non-transmittable diseases, they're not caused by a living organism. Things like heart disease, most cancers, diabetes, these are not transmittable from person to person or animal to person or food source from person or so on. You're not going to get diabetes from somebody that has diabetes by simply rubbing up against them. Epidemic, large-scale outbreak of an infectious disease. We have things that are pandemic, that are global. An epidemic would be an example, would be the Black Death or Black Plague that occurred in Europe. Pandemic would be something that goes around the world, and that's something about. So here are some things, just some stats. About 3.2 million people die from pneumonia and flu worldwide. That's transmitted via either bacterial being the pneumonia and viruses being the flu. The good thing is, of course, we got a vaccination against the flu now. That's a huge step because that's a vaccination against a virus. That's huge. HIV and AIDS, about 2.1 million people still die per year from that, and 1.9 million from viral diseases, whether it be bacterial or virus. TB, tuberculosis, which we really don't have a lot in the United States, more of a third world nation kind of thing, about 1.7 million people. That's a lung disorder or lung disease. Malaria, we still have 1 million people dying from that year. That's a protozoa, plasmodium, a little bug. Hepatitis B, which is a virus, 1 million people die from that yearly. Again, mainly third world nations. And measles, believe it or not, 800 million. We've eradicated that in the United States because we've got vaccinations that we have MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella, which you need to get before you come to a public school. However, the people that are homeschooled are starting to don't have the vaccinations. Let's talk tuberculosis, known as TB. Many people have latent TB. It's something that lays dormant. It doesn't really affect you. 1.4 million deaths per year are from this. Not latent, but it's latent, but then it comes out, primarily in less developed nations. So why is tuberculosis on the rise? We don't have enough screening. Genetic resistance is becoming very bad in many of these diseases, particularly TB. We don't have effective antibiotics against it. Of course, person-to-person contact has increased. It's something that's airborne. AIDS individuals are very susceptible to TB because they have a victim, of course. Here's a picture of it. You can see that reddish kind of color in there. That's actually a person's lungs. They cough and cough and cough and cough, and maybe even cough up a little blood from it. It can actually kill people, of course, too. Here are the estimated TB incidence rate per 100,000 people in the United States, Canada, Mexico. It happens, not very common. The regions that it really happens a lot, of course, if you look at Africa, the dark red. In regions, Southeast Asia, of course, it happens quite a bit too. Russia has a little bit higher amount of this too, again, because screening. Influenza or flu virus, of course, kills the most worldwide. People get commonly dehydrated from things like this, and they die from that too as a secondary cause. HIV infects about 2.5 million people yearly, still a huge problem, particularly in developed countries, particularly in Africa. Hepatitis B, of course, and emergent diseases are things like West Nile virus. We can get West Nile virus around here. It's actually thought right now. Viral diseases, parasites can kill large numbers of people. Viruses that move from, it should say, animals to humans are things like West Nile virus. We know it can affect birds, and then birds are bitten by mosquitoes, and then we get bitten by those mosquitoes, and we get sick and can die from that. There's a new field of ecological medicine. How do we prevent that kind of stuff? What can really reduce your chances of getting infected, even like from the common cold? Wash your hands often. Avoid touching your face. Avoid sick people. Think about the very contaminated things even within school that multiple people touch. Handrails, computer keyboards. Believe it or not, bathrooms are really clean because they get disinfected every night. But those things that really a lot of people touch, they carry these. Careful of that. Of course, the HIV epidemic or AIDS, it's caused by the human immunodeficiency virus or HIV. There's many secondary infections that go with this. Of course, HIV is the actual virus, and then what happens, it hides out in our cells, and when it's threatened, what happens is it comes out and forms the AIDS virus, and of course the AIDS virus destroys our immune system. So then people don't really die of AIDS, they actually die of like pneumonia most commonly because they have a very weakened immune system. There's no vaccine to prevent or cure AIDS. It is terrible. The best way to prevent it, of course, is education. And we have very expensive drugs that can treat it. So if you're very wealthy, generally, you can live. Magic Johnson, he's got it for like 10 years. However, he's got drugs, very expensive drugs that boost his immune system. So if he does get sick, he can still fight it off. And people, of course, don't have that. About 30 million deaths occurred between 1981 and 2012. When it came out in the 80s, very scary because people got it from blood transfusion. So you got in a car accident, you needed a blood transfusion, boom, you got it. It was terrible. Kills about 1.7 million people yearly. Of course, a lot of it sexual contact, drug use, things like that, sharing needles. Most prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa. Life expectancy dropped from 62 to 47. Terrible. And of course, their age structure pyramids are lean. Malaria, caused by a parasite carried by certain mosquitoes. It's in tropics, it's in subtropical regions. It's spread, of course, by uninfected mosquito bites infected person, and then later bites an uninfected person. What happens is that blood that's inside of it maintains the virus, and what happens is their little needle that they use to bite into you, those mosquitoes, what happens is it keeps a little blood in there, and that little blood, having bit another person that has malaria, will actually get transmitted into you, and that's enough to boom, you get it. Climate change, of course, is a huge concern because as our climate gets warmer, we get more mosquitoes, and of course we're going to get scary. These are regions where malaria are very prevalent. You can see in Africa, particularly all along the equatorial region, the tropical regions. DDT was an awesome thing to get rid of these mosquitoes. The problem is, of course, we know it's an organic pollutant, and of course it is a carcinogen. You can see one way to prevent it for this baby who has a developing immune system at this time is to sleep in a nest. Spread of this disease, it's been on the rise since 1970. Of course, more people are moving into the jungles. The jungles host the mosquitoes. Boom, we get it. It is a drug-resistant plasmodium. It is insecticide-resistant mosquitoes. So even though we spray these new insecticides on it, they oftentimes mutate the mosquitoes and, of course, become resistant to it. And, of course, as we clear the tropical forest, wow, we're getting them more. AIDS patients are particularly vulnerable. One interesting side note is, of course, people that have sickle cell anemia, which is most prominent in the African American population. Very rare, but most prominent. And what happens is they tend to be immune to not to malaria, but to the effects of an evolutionary thing there. We can reduce the incidence of infectious diseases. The good news is the percentage of worldwide deaths resulting from infectious diseases has dropped significantly by about 20% from 1970 to 2008. Again, lots of education, lots of people giving up time, doctors and nurses, volunteers going around the world and helping inoculate people too. So vaccinations have helped quite a bit. Oral hydration therapy. So when people get sick, they tend to get dehydrated and they can die from that dehydration. So we rehydrate them. That's a great thing to do. Bad news is more money is needed for medical research So infectious diseases. Increase research on diseases, particularly vaccines. Reduce poverty and malnutrition. Improve drinking water because drinking water quality generally transmits a lot of these diseases. Reduce unnecessary use of antibiotics because, as you know, antibiotics, if they're given when a person has a virus, for example, all it does is make future bacteria become resistant. Sharply reduce antibiotic use on livestock. What happens when you drink milk, for example, or even chickens that have lots of antibiotics in it? Then that antibiotic is present in your body, and bacteria can actually mutate against that. Immunize children against major viral diseases, provide oral rehydration for diarrheal victims, conduct global campaign to reduce HIV and AIDS. There is a growing concern about chemicals in the environment that can cause cancer and birth defects and disrupt the human immune and nervous system and even the endocrine system. So this stuff. Toxic chemicals, carcinogen. If you ever see that, those are chemicals, generally types of radiation, sometimes viruses that can promote cancer. HPV, of course, is human papillomavirus, which is cervical cancer. That's carried by males and occurs in females. And of course, now we've got a vaccine against that. It's a series of 3 shots that can actually take care of that, and it's given to females, actually can be given to males also. Mutagens are chemicals, radiation that cause mutations in our DNA. Teratogens, chemicals that cause harm or birth defects to a fetus or embryo. Now, in the 1940s, I believe it was, there was actually a teratogen. It was a drug given to women who got extreme morning sickness when they were pregnant. So what happened was it got rid of their morning sickness, but it caused extreme birth defects in their kids. Things like missing fingers, missing hands, other birth defects, that missing toes and things like that, that really, and they got more severe than that. So of course, they pulled that off the market too. So that's a how do we get things? Of course, we can get them from everything from drinking water and the groundwater. They can be transmitted from surface water, all these bad things. We can get them from fish, things like mercury. We can get them from breathing and atmosphere. These are all important. PCBs, as I said, are in the Great Lakes. They're everywhere. It's really a legacy from the past. They're something that was really used in industry at one time. It's a class of chlorine-containing compounds. Very stable. Now, because it's very stable, it doesn't break down in the environment very easily. They're non-flammable. They break down very slowly in the environment. So they're persistent. They travel long distances in the air. They're fat soluble. In other words, what happens is when you drink them or you ingest them through food, they stay in your fatty tissue. What happens when something stays in your fatty tissue of your body, it doesn't go away very easily. If it's water soluble, it will break down in our blood, which is mainly water, and then of course your body will get rid of it via your generally urine, or your liver beforehand will take it out, and then of course your urine will take it out. So water soluble breaks down much easier. Ends up in food chains and webs everywhere. These are banned, but they're still found everywhere. Again, industry. Some natural and synthetic chemicals in the environment can weaken and harm things like our immune system. These chemicals weaken the immune system. Neurotoxins are things like PCBs, arsenic, lead, some pesticides. They are terrible and they stay in our environment for a long time. An example of this is even methylmercury. Methylmercury is something that, again, used in industry. What happened in chemicals is the mercury, of course, is a neurotoxin that causes things like your nerves not to work correctly. So mercury, how do we prevent this? We need to phase out waste incineration. So, of course, in the United States, we don't incinerate things like garbage anymore, but other nations do. So when they do that, when they burn these products, it just gets out into the environment and it's very toxic. Remove mercury from coal before it's burned too. Good luck. Switch from coal to natural gas to renewable energy resources. That's the way to go. How do we control it? Sharply reduce mercury emissions from coal burning plants and incinerators. Label all products that contain mercury. Collect and recycle batteries and other products that contain mercury. One of the big concerns right now with compact fluorescent light bulbs is they've got a small trace of mercury in them. Well, what happens is, how do we dispose of those things? That's a big question right now. We don't know what do we do. Some things actually affect the endocrine system. The endocrine system are your glands that release hormones, regulate body systems, control sexual reproduction, growth, development, learning behavior. Things like pituitary gland in your brain is called the master gland. So at puberty time, it starts everything out, that magical time in your life, and it says, boom. If you're a male, it starts development of the testes, which produces lots of testosterone. Females' ovaries are produced, for example, and estrogen, high levels of estrogen are produced, and there's a whole bunch of different parts of our endocrine system, but some things in our environment can actually mimic these and actually cause huge problems. There's something called hormonally active agents. They're similar, and we'll get into these in class a little bit more. Shape and bind to hormone receptors. They can be hormone mimics. So in other words, what happens is they actually mimic estrogen, for example, or they mimic testosterone, for example. And what happens is that has a detrimental effect on your body. So what'll happen is if you're a male and you get more testosterone, of course, like steroids, for example, would be a hormone mimicker. Of course, there's lots of secondary effects to that. Hormone blockers are bad too, because what'll happen is instead of getting that level of testosterone that you want in your system, they block it. So you don't have that. Little diagram here, normal hormone process, what happens, we have receptors on our cell. For example, if this is testosterone, it'll land on our cell. And if it's a muscle cell, for example, it'll help develop that muscle cell. We have hormone mimickers. What happens is they'll mimic testosterone and they'll block it. Now what that does is it doesn't allow testosterone in this case. And we have something called hormone blockers where they just block everything and nothing gets in there. And we can have effects from this. We can actually have what's called gender benders. Gender benders, what happens is the natural hormones are blocked, and it actually testosterone's blocked, for example, and estrogen's introduced. So there's actually chemicals out there like DDT, for example, is an endocrine disruptor. So it'll act as a estrogen, for example. So males have that in them, and it blocks testosterone, and it introduces that estrogen into their system. So what can we do? We can eat certified organic produce and meats because those are not introduced to things like pesticides, which oftentimes are mimickers and screw up our endocrine system. They can be neurotoxins too. Avoid processed, prepackaged, and canned foods. Use glass and ceramic cookware. The big thing too, of course, as of late, was using the right plastics. You never want to heat something up in plastic or even plastic freeze because it releases things like BPA into our food. You store food and drinks in glass containers. Use only natural cleaning and personal care products. Use natural fabric shower curtains, not vinyl. Avoid artificial air fresheners, fabric softeners, dryer sheets, something we all use. Use only glass baby bottles and BPA-free, phthalate-free sipping cups, pacifiers, and toys, because those are the things that release these toxins. Basically, what happens, again, don't heat things up in plastic, because when you put plastic in your microwave, it releases these really bad toxins. And those really bad toxins, what happens is we breathe them in or we ingest them, and of course, they mimic, they destroy our normal body functions. That's it for part 1.